Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbart Gaming. I'm going to try something a little different for today's video. I decided to do a little grab bag of facts about various old game systems and computers. I'm going to keep this one relatively short and to the point, so sit back, relax, and enjoy this brief mini facts episode. Let's get on with it. The Intellivision was the first game console to have a 16-bit processor. Kind of. Now I know, I hear you. Hey, didn't you tell us in the Sega Genesis / Mega Drive facts video that it was the first 16-bit console? And yes, I did. And yes, strictly speaking, it was. But sometimes, there's a little more to the story. Here's the Intellivision. It came out way back in 1979 and was a contemporary competitor to the Atari 2600/VCS. I won't get into how good or not its games were in this episode. Instead, I want to focus on what's inside the Intellivision. It's powered by a General Instruments CP1610 CPU that runs at a meager 894 kilohertz. That's right, kilohertz, not megahertz. And that made the raw clock speed of the Intellivision lower than pretty much all of its competitors. For some, it was quite a bit slower. But the speed isn't the only bit of weirdness here. Why did I introduce this segment by saying the Intellivision CP1610 CPU is only kind of 16-bit? While the CPU is technically a 16-bit CPU with 16-bit address width, all of its instructions have a maximum opcode width of 10 bits. This 10-bit structure is called a decal. That means to execute a 16-bit instruction, it had to be executed as a pair of two instructions. That setup is known as a bidecal. The processor does have 16-bit registers, which can be used for general arithmetic. Still, I don't like calling a CPU a 16-bit CPU if it can't process a 16-bit instruction in one go. There are also 8-bit components mixed up in the architecture in general here. Anywho, to finish this section off, Honeywell, known for its appliances and industrial equipment, also did use the 1610 in some of its products. The Intellivision was pretty much the only quote-unquote popular use of the General Instruments 1610 CPU. And the 1610 CPU was essentially a slower variant of the CP1600 CPU. The 1610 ran just a bit under half the clock speed of the original 1600. Now in the mid-1980s, General Instruments basically faded from the marketplace, and they spun off their microchip division into its own subsidiary, which became incorporated as Microchip Technology in 1989. And that company is still alive and kicking today. But a look at those 2024 financials indicates that things could probably be better for them right now. The Texas Instruments TI-99-4 was the first 16-bit home computer. Kind of. You might be thinking to yourself that either the Atari ST or the Amiga was the first home computer with a 16-bit CPU. If you think that, well, you're wrong! Still, why do I say that Texas Instruments TI-99-4 or 4A was only kind of 16-bit? The truth is, a lot of this bitness stuff was never really cut and dry even back in the day, but let me explain. The TI-99/4, and I'm just going to say TI-99-4, came out in 1979. It was replaced by the TI-99-4A in June of 1981. The new model had a much nicer keyboard and was about half the price of the original. Side note, I actually had a 4A and got to play some of the games on this thing in real life back when I was a kid and this thing was brand new. Now, it was a flawed, limited computer in a lot of ways, even when it was new, but that's a story for another time. Inside of the TI-99-4 and 4A, we'd find a TMS 9900 CPU running at about 3 MHz. The support chips that constituted the rest of the architecture were very much products of their time, and it produced visuals similar to what we'd see on Atari 8-bit computers and the C64 in many respects. Now, it won't shock you to learn that building a full 16-bit home computer in 1979 would have been really expensive. Much more so than the $1,150 at which the original 4 model sold. And that's almost $5,000 adjusted for inflation at the end of 2024. So Texas Instruments built a system that was really only part 16-bit. There was a 16-bit data bus for some hardware access, but also an 8-bit bus to communicate with essentially all the supporting chips inside the computer. Unlike the Intellivision CP1610, however, the TMS 9900 does execute 16-bit instructions, and not only does it execute them in one go, it actually requires all instructions be at least 16-bit. Anyway, in the interest of keeping this video relatively short, let's just say that the performance of this system was nowhere near what most people would come to expect out of a 16-bit computer. The TI-99-4 and 4A were just okay performance-wise, even for the time they came out. It wasn't really the tech inside the computer itself that killed TI's attempt at cracking the home computer market, though. It was much more the business decisions made around the computer and the market. The stupid daisy chaining of accessories didn't help things either, but again, that's a story for another time. A few guys were key in designing a bunch of the systems that you know. This is Jay Miner. Well, was. He sadly passed away back in 1994. But you probably know his work. He was hired by Atari in 1975 to design some of the chips in the Atari VCS/2600. He'd also play a key role in the design of the Atari 400 and 800 8-bit computers. But after this, Jay would go on to essentially become the lead engineer on the revolutionary Amiga computer. He'd originally wanted to work on a 16-bit game system, but after the American gaming market crash in 1983, the focus of the project was shifted to creating a 16-bit home computer instead. Now here's where we introduce a few new real-life characters to our story, RJ Michael and Dave Needle. And forgive me, but I'm going to condense the story a bit here. I may do a comprehensive video on some of this stuff later. Let's start with Dave. Dave Needle, who sadly passed away in 2016, was another engineer that had worked on the Amiga and stayed on when the company was purchased by Commodore. It was here that Dave met RJ Michael, who'd worked on designing the interface for the Amiga's operating system. After their work on the Amiga computer, the duo would collaborate on two other big hardware projects. RJ Michael left Commodore in 1987, but still worked with them as a contractor. But RJ Michael ended up working for Epix, as did Dave Needle. Epix was primarily known at the time for its software and some peripherals it dabbled in. However, RJ Michael and Dave Needle ended up co-designing something a little more ambitious for Epix, a new hardware project that went under the codename Handy. Handy was something new and fresh, an entirely self-contained color handheld system. The project would later be purchased by Atari, and you know it better as the Atari Lynx. But before Atari got involved, RJ Michael and Dave Needle warned Epix that Atari would screw up the Lynx in several ways. For example, Atari had a terrible reputation for treating its employees poorly, and they also had a bad reputation in the retail market at this point. RJ and Dave threatened to quit Epix if they sold the Lynx to Atari. And, well, Epix sold the Lynx to Atari. RJ and Dave quit. After the Amiga and the Lynx, RJ Michael and Dave Needle would collaborate one more time on a relatively famous hardware design, and they started working on it literally the day after they quit Epix. Michael and Needle co-founded NTG, short for New Technologies Group. They worked on a system that would be unlike any that had come before it. It would be CD-based and process graphics in a way very different from prior systems. That new system's working codename was Opera, but it later came to be known as the 3DO. Several people that had worked on the Amiga back in the day joined the team working on the 3DO. Now in the end, none of these platforms ended up being as successful as they should have been for various reasons. The Amiga was the most successful hardware of the bunch, followed by the 3DO and then the Lynx. Anyway, really, what's the moral of this story? Corporations, often poorly run, can and will completely screw up pretty good hardware design with stupid business decisions, particularly on price. The ColecoVision, the original MSX computer, and the SG-1000 had basically the same hardware. I talked about this a bit in my Sega 8-bit Facts video, but it's worth elaborating on here. The ColecoVision was a system built with off-the-shelf parts, so to speak, meaning none of its chips were custom engineered. Coleco used existing chips like the Z80 CPU, the TI PSG for sound, and a TI-9918A chip as its VDP, or Video Display Processor. Now the SG-1000, Sega's first ever home system, which was only released in Japan and a few other select territories, had essentially the exact same hardware as the ColecoVision. Same CPU, same sound chip, and same VDP. There are even a few systems out there from third parties like Telegames and their personal arcade that can play cartridges from either the ColecoVision or the SG-1000. Just a little bit of addressing is different between the two systems, and the ColecoVision had more video RAM. Now the MSX computer line is a little bit different in some ways, but not very. Again, we'll find the same Z80 CPU, the same VDP, which is a TI-9918 or one of its variants, but the big difference we'll find here is that the sound chip inside the original MSX is a bit different. It uses a General Instruments AY38910, which could be found in several other home computers of the era. Wait a minute, General Instruments, they sound familiar. Oh yes, they were the company that made the Intellivision CP1610 CPU that I started this video with. Anyway, back on task here. Why did these systems have essentially the same hardware in them? Did one come along first that everyone else copied? Well, that's a tough question to answer. The ColecoVision came out in August of 1982, the SG-1000 came out in July of 1983, and the first MSX was released in October of 1983. But we can't go by release dates alone. All of these systems were in development long before they were released. Now, one really odd factor here is that Sega had struck a deal to distribute the ColecoVision in Japan in 1982, part of which was a stipulation that Sega would put their games on the ColecoVision hardware. You may be wondering, how do I know this seemingly obscure fact that you may not have seen anywhere else? Well, don't worry, I bring the receipts as always, dear viewers. What you're looking at now is Cashbox Magazine. This is the April 3rd, 1982 issue, and you can clearly see right here they had reported on the deal between Sega and ColecoVision. Now, that deal fell through, and Sega ended up not distributing the ColecoVision in Japan, and the system was in fact never released in Japan. However, the following year, of course, Sega released the incredibly similar SG-1000, so Sega obviously just stole the hardware, right? Well, that's unclear. Why? Because rumor has it that Sega was test marketing the SG-1000 as early as 1981. Personally, I don't put much stock in that rumor, but you will find that reported on many places. I've just never seen an actual source that can prove it. However, there are a few important things to consider that probably clear this up. First, once again, these were all off-the-shelf parts and components inside these devices, so anyone looking to build a relatively cheap system back between 1981 and 1983 could have easily designed the same system using the same CPU, VDP, RAM, and sound chip. Second, companies were just as litigious back then as they are today, so there very likely would have been lawsuits filed if one of these companies involved had stolen the design from any of the others. So when we consider all of those things, I don't think anyone stole the hardware design from anyone else for any of these systems. In fact, there are even a few lesser-known computers I didn't discuss here that also had almost the exact same hardware. And you know what? Let's go ahead and end it there. So we had a few little interesting bite-sized facts about some older gaming and computer hardware. So tell me, did you all know all of this already? Was there anything that you learned here today for the first time? Do you like this format of a more bite-sized video? Tell me all about it in the comments. That'll do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed it, please like it and share it online somewhere. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. If you want to support the work that I do here, you can do that on Patreon, Ko-fi, or right here on YouTube through channel memberships. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.